known to history as Al Capone, was born on the 17th of January, 1899, as Alphonse Gabriel Capone in the borough of Brooklyn in New York City. His father was Gabriele Capone, an Italian immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1893 from the town of Angri in the Campania region of southern Italy. Gabriele worked as a barber to support his large family, operating a small barbershop on Park Avenue in Brooklyn, though he struggled to make ends meet in the competitive immigrant neighborhoods of the city. Al's mother was Teresina Capone, who was born Teresina Raiola, also from Angri. She had immigrated to America with Gabriele, and along with raising their 9 children, she worked occasionally as a seamstress to supplement the family's meager income. Alphonse was the 4th of 9 children born to the Capones, arriving after Vincenzo, Raffaele, and Salvatore, and before Ermina, Umberto, Matthew, Rose, and Mafalda. The family lived in a cramped tenement apartment on Navy Street in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn, sharing the building and the surrounding blocks with hundreds of other recently arrived Italian immigrant families. Although he was born in Brooklyn, when Al was still quite young, the family relocated to 38 Garfield Place in the same borough. It is worth reflecting on the development of Brooklyn and the immigrant communities within it during this period, as these circumstances would shape the criminal underworld which Al Capone would soon enter. Brooklyn had grown dramatically in the late 19th century, developing from a collection of small towns and villages into a major urban center. The population increased from approximately 400,000 people in 1870 to over 1 million by the time Al was born, driven by waves of immigration from southern and eastern Europe. Italian immigrants in particular began arriving in massive numbers in the 1880s and 1890s, fleeing poverty and limited economic opportunities in southern Italy. By 1900, there were over 200,000 Italian immigrants living in New York City, with significant concentrations in Brooklyn neighborhoods such as Park Slope, Red Hook, and Navy Yard. And this growth did not stop there. By the time Al entered his teenage years in the early 1910s, the Italian population in Brooklyn had swelled to over 400,000 people, making it one of the largest Italian communities outside of Italy itself. These immigrant neighborhoods were characterized by extreme poverty, overcrowded tenements, and limited access to legitimate economic opportunities. Many Italian immigrant families lived in squalid conditions, with multiple families sharing single apartments and entire extended families working simply to survive. The result of this was a community with endemic poverty and a young generation of Italian Americans who saw few paths to economic advancement through legitimate means. Moreover, the neighborhoods were largely ignored by city authorities, creating an environment in which street gangs and criminal organizations could flourish with little interference from the police, particularly as many officers could be easily bribed by those engaged in illicit activities. As New York developed economically and demographically in the early 20th century, so too did the criminal enterprises which operated in its boroughs, and Brooklyn in particular became a breeding ground for organized crime as young men like Al Capone looked for ways to escape the poverty into which they had been born. As a child, Al attended Public School 7 on Adam Street in Brooklyn, where he proved to be a capable student in his early years, demonstrating particular aptitude in mathematics and reading. However, By the time he reached his early teenage years, his behavior had begun to deteriorate significantly, and he frequently clashed with teachers and other students at the school. In 1914, when Al was 14 years old, he was expelled from the school after striking a female teacher who had hit him first during a disciplinary incident. The exact details of the altercation remain somewhat unclear, but the result was that Al's formal education came to an abrupt end, and he never returned to complete his schooling. Following his expulsion, Al took a series of odd jobs to help support his family, working in a candy store, a bowling alley, and a paper factory. But these legitimate occupations held little appeal for the young man, and he was soon drawn into the street gangs which proliferated throughout Brooklyn's Italian neighborhoods. By the time he was 15, Al had joined the 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York City at the time. The gang, which had been founded in the 1890s and took its name from the 5 Points neighborhood in Lower Manhattan, was involved in a wide range of illegal activities, including theft, extortion, prostitution, and gambling operations. The 5 Points Gang was led by Frankie Yale, whose real name was Francesco Ioele, an Italian-American gangster who would become one of the most significant influences on the young Capone. Yale operated a bar and brothel called the Harvard Inn in the Coney Island neighborhood of Brooklyn, and it was here that he employed Al as a bartender and bouncer when he was in his late teens. Working at the Harvard Inn, Capone was exposed to the full range of criminal activities which characterized the underworld of New York in the 1910s, from illegal gambling and prostitution to robbery and violent intimidation. And he proved adept at all of these activities, quickly earning Yale's trust and respect through his willingness to use violence when necessary and his natural talent for intimidation. It was also at the Harvard Inn that Al acquired the facial scars, which would later earn him the nickname Scarface, a moniker which he despised throughout his life. In 1917, when he was 18 years old, Capone made an insulting remark to a young woman at the bar, commenting on her appearance in a crude manner. The woman's brother, Frank Galluccio, took offense and confronted Capone, and when the altercation escalated, Galluccio pulled out a knife and slashed Al 3 times across the left side of his face, leaving him with permanent scars which ran from his ear to his jaw. Capone initially sought revenge for the attack, but Frankie Yale intervened and forced Al to apologize to Galluccio, as Galluccio was connected to powerful figures in the Italian underworld who Yale did not wish to antagonize. Thus, Capone was compelled to let the matter rest, though the scars remained a source of embarrassment for him, and in later years he would often claim they were war wounds from service in World War I, despite never having served in the military. While working for Yale in these years, Al also came into contact with Johnny Torrio, another prominent Italian-American gangster who had been Yale's mentor in the early years of the 20th century. Torrio had since relocated to Chicago, where he was building a criminal empire, but he maintained close ties with Yale and would occasionally return to New York to conduct business. Torrio recognized potential in the young Capone, noting his intelligence, his capacity for violence, and his loyalty to those who employed him. Consequently, when Torrio was looking to expand his operations in Chicago in the late 1910s, he kept Capone in mind as a possible recruit. Meanwhile, Al's personal life was also developing during this period. In 1918, when he was 19 years old, he married May Josephine Coughlin, an Irish-American woman from Brooklyn who was 2 years his senior. May was already pregnant at the time of their marriage, and on the 4th of December 1918, she gave birth to their son, Albert Francis Capone, who was known as Sonny throughout his life. The birth of his son appears to have had some impact on Al's thinking about his future, as he briefly attempted to pursue legitimate employment, working as a bookkeeper for a construction company. However, this foray into respectable work lasted only a few months before he returned to criminal activities, finding the pay and excitement of the underworld far more appealing than the drudgery of legitimate labor. In 1919, an incident occurred which accelerated Capone's departure from New York. While the exact details remain disputed, it appears that Al was involved in a murder in Brooklyn, possibly the killing of a rival gang member, and that the police were beginning to investigate his involvement. Facing potential prosecution and aware that Torrio had extended an offer to join his organization in Chicago, Capone decided to leave New York. Thus, in 1920, Al Capone, along with his wife May and their young son Sonny, relocated to Chicago, where he would begin working for Johnny Torrio, and where he would ultimately build the most powerful criminal organization in American history. And little did they know it at the time, that this move would transform an ambitious Brooklyn street tough into the most notorious gangster America had ever known. The subsequent rise of Al Capone has to be considered in light of the history of the United States in the early 20th century and the development of prohibition. In some senses, organized crime and the prohibition of alcohol cannot be disentangled in early 20th century America. The movement to ban alcohol in the United States had its origins in the temperance campaigns of the 19th century, driven primarily by Protestant religious groups and women's organizations who viewed alcohol as a source of moral decay and domestic violence. Organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1874 and 1893 respectively, had been campaigning for decades to restrict or eliminate the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages throughout the country. These efforts gained significant momentum during World War I, when anti-German sentiment made it easier to target the brewing industry, which was dominated by German-American entrepreneurs. Additionally, the war effort created a climate in which the conservation of grain for food production could be used as a justification for limiting alcohol production. As a result, on the 18th of December 1917, the United States Congress passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors throughout the country. The amendment was ratified by the required number of states on the 16th of January 1919 and came into effect 1 year later on the 17th of January 1920, the day after Al Capone's 21st birthday. To enforce the amendment, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act, commonly known as the Volstead Act after its sponsor, Representative Andrew Volstead of Minnesota, in October 1919. The Volstead Act defined the specific penalties for violating prohibition and established the enforcement mechanisms that would be used to police the new law. However, the implementation of prohibition created immediate and profound problems throughout American society. The United States had a well-established culture of alcohol consumption, particularly in urban areas with large immigrant populations from countries such as Italy, Ireland, and Germany, where drinking was an integral part of social and cultural life. Moreover, the economic impact of prohibition was substantial. The legal alcohol industry had employed hundreds of thousands of workers in breweries, distilleries, bars, and restaurants, and had generated enormous tax revenues for federal, state, and local governments. All of this was now eliminated overnight, creating both unemployment and a significant loss of government income at a time when the country was adjusting to the post-war economy. The result of this was the immediate creation of a massive black market for alcohol. Americans who wished to continue drinking, and there were millions of them, now had to obtain their alcohol through illegal channels, creating unprecedented opportunities for criminal enterprises willing to manufacture, import, and distribute alcoholic beverages in defiance of federal law. And the enforcement of prohibition proved woefully inadequate from the outset. The federal government allocated limited resources to the Prohibition Bureau, the agency tasked with enforcing the Volstead Act, and by the mid-1920s, there were fewer than 3,000 agents responsible for policing alcohol prohibition across the entire country. Many of these agents were poorly trained and poorly paid, making them susceptible to bribery and corruption from the very criminals they were supposed to be investigating. State and local police forces were similarly undermanned and often unwilling to prioritize prohibition enforcement, particularly in urban areas where public opinion was largely opposed to the law. In cities such as New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, the police were frequently paid off by bootleggers and speakeasy operators, creating a culture of corruption that extended from street-level officers all the way to police chiefs and political leaders. This widespread corruption was facilitated by the enormous profits available in the illegal alcohol trade. A case of liquor that could be purchased for a few dollars in Canada or produced illegally in the United States could be sold for 10 or 20 times that amount to speakeasies and individual consumers who were desperate for alcohol and willing to pay premium prices for it. Consequently, the potential profits in bootlegging were so substantial that they attracted ambitious criminals throughout the country, including young men like Al Capone, who saw prohibition as an opportunity to build fortunes that would have been impossible through legitimate means. Meanwhile, the political environment in many American cities further enabled the growth of organized crime during this period. Political machines, particularly in cities with large immigrant populations, had long operated through systems of patronage and corruption, with elected officials and party bosses controlling access to jobs, contracts, and services in exchange for political support and financial kickbacks. In Chicago, the political machine was dominated by figures such as Mayor William Hale Thompson, known as Big Bill Thompson, who served 3 terms as mayor between 1915 and 1931. Thompson's administration was notoriously corrupt, with city officials openly accepting bribes from bootleggers and gambling operators in exchange for protection from law enforcement. This created an environment in which organized crime could flourish with minimal interference from the authorities, as long as the criminals were willing to share their profits with the politicians who controlled the city. The combination of widespread public opposition to prohibition, inadequate enforcement resources, endemic political corruption, and enormous profit potential created ideal conditions for the emergence of powerful criminal organizations throughout urban America in the 1920s. These organizations, often organized along ethnic lines, with Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other groups establishing their own territories and operations, developed sophisticated networks for importing, manufacturing, and distributing illegal alcohol on a massive scale. Thus, the implementation of prohibition in America during the period of Capone's arrival in Chicago cannot be separated from the political and social circumstances of the country during the early 1920s. This was the world into which Al Capone was emerging in 1920. By the time he arrived in Chicago, the man who would subsequently proclaim that he was simply, quote, a businessman giving the people what they want, was entering a city where prohibition had created unprecedented opportunities for those willing to operate outside the law, and where the political establishment was willing to tolerate and even profit from criminal enterprises as long as they received their share of the proceeds. Working in association with Johnny Torrio, Al was initially employed as a bouncer and bartender at several of Torrio's establishments on the south side of Chicago, including the Four Juices, a bar and brothel located at 2222 South Wabash Avenue, which served as the headquarters of Torrio's criminal operations. Torrio had built a substantial criminal empire in Chicago since his arrival in the city in 1909, working under the protection of Big Jim Colosimo, an Italian immigrant who had established himself as the most powerful crime boss on the South Side. Colosimo controlled a network of brothels, gambling operations, and other illicit enterprises, and had made Torrio his chief lieutenant to oversee the day-to-day operations of these businesses. However, when Prohibition came into effect in 1920, Torrio recognized immediately that bootlegging offered far greater profit potential than prostitution or gambling ever could. He urged Colosimo to expand into the illegal alcohol trade, but Colosimo, who had grown wealthy and comfortable from his existing operations, was reluctant to take on the additional risks and complications that bootlegging would entail. Frustrated by his boss's unwillingness to capitalize on the opportunities created by Prohibition, Torrio began to make plans to remove Colosimo from power. On the 11th of May 1920, just 4 months after Prohibition came into effect, Big Jim Colosimo was shot and killed in the vestibule of his restaurant, Colosimo's Cafe, on South Wabash Avenue. The murder was never officially solved, but there was widespread suspicion that Torrio had ordered the killing and that the actual shooter was Frankie Yale, who had traveled from New York to Chicago specifically for this purpose. Al Capone, who had connections to both Torrio and Yale, was also suspected of involvement, though no charges were ever filed against any of them. With Colosimo dead, Torrio assumed control of the South Side operations and immediately began expanding into bootlegging. He established connections with breweries and distilleries, some of which operated legally by producing near beer and other low-alcohol beverages permitted under the Volstead Act, but which secretly continued to produce full-strength beer and liquor for the illegal market. Torrio also arranged for the importation of Canadian whiskey across the border and the smuggling of rum from the Caribbean through various ports along the East Coast. Capone proved invaluable in these operations, demonstrating both the intelligence and the ruthlessness necessary to succeed in the bootlegging business. He managed several of Torrio's speakeasies, ensuring that they were supplied with alcohol, that the profits were properly accounted for, and that any threats from rival gangs or law enforcement were dealt with swiftly and decisively. Before long, Capone was cutting out some of the intermediaries in Torrio's supply chain and developing his own relationships with suppliers and distributors. He also began to take on greater responsibilities in the enforcement side of the business, using violence and intimidation to protect Torrio's territory from encroachment by rival gangs and to discipline any speakeasy operators who attempted to cheat the organization. And Capone was more ambitious still. He wanted not merely to be Torrio's lieutenant, but to expand the organization's reach and influence throughout Chicago and beyond. By the early 1920s, this included establishing operations in the western suburbs of the city, particularly in the town of Cicero, where local officials were more easily corrupted than those in Chicago proper. Torrio recognized and valued Capone's ambition and abilities, and increasingly relied on him to handle the most difficult and dangerous aspects of the business. The relationship between the two men was that of mentor and protégé, with Torrio teaching Capone the intricacies of managing a large criminal enterprise, including the importance of maintaining good relationships with politicians and police, the necessity of keeping accurate financial records, and the strategic use of violence to maintain control without attracting excessive attention from federal authorities. By the mid-1920s, Capone had established himself as Torrio's most trusted lieutenant and was effectively co-managing the organization's extensive bootlegging operations, which now generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. However, circumstances would soon force Torrio to make a decision that would elevate Capone to absolute power in Chicago's underworld. In January 1925, Johnny Torrio was ambushed outside his apartment building at 7011 South Clyde Avenue and shot multiple times by members of the Northside Gang, a rival organization led by Dino Banyan until his assassination the previous year, and now controlled by Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran. The attack occurred in broad daylight as Torrio and his wife Anna were returning from a shopping trip. Two gunmen opened fire on Torrio with shotguns and pistols, hitting him in the jaw, chest, abdomen, and arm. His wife was not harmed, but Torrio was left critically wounded and was rushed to Jackson Park Hospital, where doctors managed to save his life after emergency surgery. While recovering in the hospital, Torrio came to a decision that would alter the course of Chicago's criminal history. He concluded that the constant warfare with rival gangs and the ever-present threat of assassination were no longer worth the profits his organization generated. Consequently, upon his release from the hospital in February 1925, Torrio announced his retirement from the bootlegging business and his intention to return to Italy, leaving his entire criminal empire to Al Capone. Thus, at the age of 26, Capone found himself in control of the most powerful criminal organization in Chicago, with operations generating several $1 million annually and a network of speakeasies, breweries, gambling dens, and brothels throughout the city and its suburbs. Capone immediately set about consolidating and expanding the organization, which became known as the Chicago Outfit. He surrounded himself with a group of loyal and capable lieutenants who would help him manage the various aspects of the business and enforce his authority throughout the city. Chief among these was Jake Guzik, a Jewish accountant and financial manager who oversaw the outfit's bookkeeping operations and money laundering activities, ensuring that the vast sums of cash flowing through the organization were properly accounted for and hidden from federal authorities. Guzik had been working with Torrio before Capone's arrival and proved invaluable in managing the increasingly complex financial operations of the expanding empire. Another key associate was Frank Nitti, an Italian immigrant who had arrived in Chicago in 1913 and had established himself as one of the outfit's most effective enforcers. Nitti specialized in labor racketeering and extortion and would eventually become Capone's primary lieutenant and his designated successor. Tony Accardo, a young enforcer who joined the organization in the mid-1920s, would also prove to be one of Capone's most trusted associates. Accardo was involved in numerous violent incidents on behalf of the outfit and demonstrated both ruthlessness and intelligence in carrying out Capone's orders. Murray Humphreys, known as the Camel, was another important member of the organization, specializing in political corruption and labor union control. Humphreys was responsible for maintaining the outfit's relationships with corrupt politicians and police officials, ensuring that the organization could operate with minimal interference from law enforcement. With this team in place, Capone began to dramatically expand the outfit's operations throughout Chicago and the surrounding areas. The organization now controlled hundreds of speakeasies across the city, ranging from upscale establishments that catered to wealthy patrons to working-class saloons in immigrant neighborhoods. Each of these establishments paid tribute to Capone in exchange for protection and a guaranteed supply of alcohol. The outfit also operated numerous brothels and gambling operations, generating additional millions of dollars in annual revenue. Capone invested heavily in horse racing and dog racing tracks, as well as illegal casinos where high-stakes poker and dice games attracted wealthy gamblers willing to wager enormous sums. Beyond these traditional criminal enterprises, Capone also expanded into labor racketeering, using violence and intimidation to take control of several Chicago labor unions. Once in control of these unions, the outfit could extort money from businesses by threatening strikes and labor disruptions, while also skimming money from union dues and pension funds. Protection rackets provided yet another revenue stream. Businesses throughout Chicago were forced to pay regular tribute to the outfit in exchange for protection from vandalism, arson, and violence, with those who refused to pay facing brutal consequences. And the outfit's reach extended well beyond the city limits of Chicago. In 1924, even before assuming full control of the organization, Capone had orchestrated a takeover of the town of Cicero, a working-class suburb just west of Chicago, with a population of approximately 60,000 people. The takeover of Cicero was achieved through a combination of violence and electoral fraud. In the municipal elections of April 1924, Capone sent hundreds of his men into Cicero to intimidate voters and election officials, ensuring that candidates friendly to the outfit won control of the town government. Several people were killed during the election day violence, including Capone's brother Frank, who was shot and killed by Chicago police who had been sent to Cicero to prevent the outfit's interference in the election. Despite the loss of his brother, Capone succeeded in taking control of Cicero, and the town became a major center of the outfit's operations, with dozens of speakeasies, gambling dens, and brothels operating openly under the protection of the corrupt town government. The Hawthorne Inn on 22nd Street in Cicero became one of Capone's primary headquarters, and he spent much of his time there overseeing operations. To maintain control over this vast criminal empire, Capone developed an elaborate system of bribes and payoffs to police, politicians, and judges throughout Chicago and Cook County. It was estimated that the outfit spent over $30 million annually on corruption, ensuring that law enforcement would turn a blind eye to the organization's activities and that any members who were arrested would face minimal consequences. Police officers on the beat received regular payments to ignore speakeasies and gambling operations in their districts. Precinct captains and district commanders received larger sums to ensure that their subordinates cooperated. Politicians, from aldermen to state legislators, were paid to oppose any efforts to strengthen prohibition enforcement or to investigate organized crime. And judges were bribed to dismiss cases or impose lenient sentences on outfit members who did end up in court. Soon, Capone's operation was responsible for supplying the majority of illegal alcohol consumed in Chicago, a city of nearly 3 million people where millions of gallons of beer and liquor were sold every year despite prohibition. The organization was also deeply involved in nearly every other form of vice and criminal activity in the city. As a result, operations expanded beyond Chicago as well, with the outfit establishing connections with bootlegging operations in other cities and beginning to supply alcohol to speakeasies in cities throughout the Midwest. Capone also developed relationships with smugglers who brought Canadian whiskey across the border and with rum runners who transported Caribbean alcohol to the United States. The outfit was now generating revenues estimated at between $70 million and $100 million annually by the late 1920s, a sum which would amount to well over $1 billion in today's money when adjusted for inflation. Of this, Capone himself was believed to be personally receiving between $20 million and $25 million per year, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in America. The organization had created an industry of vice throughout Chicago and the surrounding region, employing thousands of people in various capacities and corrupting every level of government and law enforcement in the process. With some of the proceeds from his operations, Al purchased a sprawling estate on Palm Island in Miami Beach, Florida, in 1928 for $40,000. The property, which would become his primary residence and retreat from the violence and pressures of Chicago, consisted of a large 2-story mansion with 14 rooms, along with a gatehouse, pool, dock, and extensive grounds covering approximately 1 acre of land. Capone invested substantial additional sums in renovating and fortifying the property. He had a 7-foot-high coral rock wall constructed around the entire estate for security, along with floodlights and an elaborate alarm system. The mansion itself was furnished lavishly with expensive furniture, artwork, and fixtures imported from Europe, and Capone maintained a full staff of servants, gardeners, and security personnel to care for the property. The estate served not only as a personal residence, but also as a location where Capone could entertain guests, conduct business away from the scrutiny of Chicago authorities, and maintain the alibi of being a legitimate Florida resident when crimes occurred in Chicago. He would spend increasing amounts of time at the Palm Island property as the pressures from law enforcement intensified in the late 1920s and early 1930s. In Chicago itself, Capone established his primary headquarters at the Lexington Hotel at 2135 South Michigan Avenue, taking over an entire floor of the building for his personal offices and living quarters. The Lexingtons served as the nerve center of the outfit's operations, where Capone held meetings with his lieutenants, conducted negotiations with politicians and rival gangsters, and managed the day-to-day affairs of his criminal empire. Elsewhere, Capone maintained the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero as a secondary headquarters and base of operations for the outfit's substantial activities in that town. The Hawthorne was fortified like a fortress, with steel shutters on the windows and armed guards stationed at every entrance, reflecting the constant threat of attack from rival gangs. Capone also amassed a fleet of luxury automobiles, including several custom-built armored Cadillacs equipped with bulletproof glass, reinforced steel plating, and hidden gun compartments. These vehicles, which cost up to $30,000 each, were necessary given the numerous assassination attempts that Capone faced from rival gangsters throughout the 1920s. He employed a team of armed drivers and bodyguards who accompanied him whenever he traveled through Chicago. In terms of personal appearance, Capone cultivated an image of wealth and respectability, spending enormous sums on custom-tailored suits from the finest haberdashers in Chicago and New York. He favored expensive silk shirts, diamond jewelry, and fedora hats, and was known for his fastidious attention to his appearance, often changing clothes several times a day. His wardrobe was valued at over $50,000, and he owned dozens of suits, hundreds of shirts, and scores of pairs of shoes. To soften his image further, Capone engaged in various charitable activities, particularly during the Great Depression, which began in 1929. He opened soup kitchens in Chicago that provided free meals to unemployed and homeless individuals, serving thousands of people every day during the worst years of the economic crisis. These soup kitchens were well publicized, and Capone made sure that reporters and photographers were present to document his charitable efforts. At Thanksgiving and Christmas, Capone distributed free food and clothing to poor families in Chicago, often personally handing out turkeys, canned goods, and cash gifts to long lines of grateful recipients. These events drew enormous crowds and generated positive press coverage that helped to counterbalance the negative publicity surrounding his criminal activities. In this way, he bought the adulation of many Chicagoans, particularly those in poor and working-class neighborhoods who viewed him as a benefactor who provided both jobs and charity during difficult economic times. Many people in these communities saw Capone as someone who had succeeded through his own efforts and who gave back to those less fortunate, in contrast to the wealthy businessmen and corrupt politicians who they felt had abandoned them. Capone also cultivated relationships with members of the press, granting interviews and providing quotes that portrayed him as a misunderstood businessman who was simply providing a service that people wanted. He famously declared that he was a public benefactor and that all he did was satisfy a public demand. He claimed that prohibition was an unjust law that criminalized normal social behavior, and that he was no different from legitimate businessmen except that his product happened to be illegal. The press, for their part, found Capone to be excellent copy. He was quotable, colorful, and willing to speak openly about his activities in ways that other criminals were not. Newspapers ran stories about his lavish lifestyle, his charitable activities, and his battles with rival gangs, making him one of the most famous figures in America by the late 1920s. Capone attended sporting events, particularly boxing matches and baseball games, where he sat in prominent seats and was cheered by crowds who admired his wealth and notoriety. He went to the opera and theater, dined at expensive restaurants, and generally conducted himself in public as if he were a legitimate businessman rather than a criminal who had built his fortune through bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. Despite such efforts to soften his image, by the late 1920s, Al was well known as the head of the Chicago outfit and was a marked man by both rival gangs and law enforcement. His visibility and the violence required to maintain his empire would soon culminate in an event that would transform public perception and mark the beginning of his downfall. On the 14th of February, 1929, 7 members of the Northside Gang were lined up against a wall in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago and executed by gunmen disguised as police officers. The victims included 6 members of the Northside Gang and an optometrist who happened to be in the garage at the time. They were identified as Peter Gusenberg, Frank Gusenberg, Albert Kakelek, Adam Heyer, Reinhard Schwimmer, Albert Weinschenk, and John May. The gunmen, who arrived in a vehicle marked to resemble a police car, ordered the victims to line up facing the wall, then opened fire with Thompson's submachine guns and shotguns, killing all but one of them instantly. Frank Gusenberg survived long enough to be taken to a hospital, but died 3 hours later without revealing who had attacked them. The massacre was the culmination of years of escalating violence between Capone's Chicago outfit and the Northside Gang, a predominantly Irish criminal organization that controlled bootlegging operations on the north side of Chicago. The rivalry had its origins in the murder of Dean O'Banion, the leader of the Northside Gang, in November 1924. O'Banion had been shot and killed in his flower shop on North State Street by gunmen widely believed to have been sent by Capone and his associates in retaliation for various disputes over territory and bootlegging operations. Following O'Banion's death, control of the Northside Gang passed to Jaime Weiss and later to Bugs Moran, both of whom were determined to avenge their former leader's murder. Weiss had made several attempts to assassinate Capone in the years following O'Banion's death. In September 1926, a convoy of vehicles filled with Northside Gang gunmen drove past the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero and opened fire with machine guns, spraying the building with over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Capone, who was inside the hotel at the time, was uninjured in the attack, though several bystanders were wounded. Weiss himself was killed in October 1926 when he was ambushed outside Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago, shot by gunmen positioned in a building across the street. The killing was widely attributed to Capone's organization, further intensifying the conflict between the two gangs. By 1929, with Bugs Moran now leading the Northside Gang, the violence had escalated to the point where both organizations were losing men regularly in ambushes and drive-by shootings throughout Chicago. Capone, seeking to eliminate his rivals decisively, planned the St. Valentine's Day Massacre as a way to wipe out the Northside Gang's leadership in a single operation. The massacre succeeded in killing several important members of the Northside Gang, but Moran himself was not present in the garage at the time of the attack, having been delayed and arriving after the gunman had fled. Consequently, the primary target of the operation survived, and the North Side Gang, though weakened, continued to operate for several more years. The public reaction to the St. Valentine's Day massacre was one of shock and outrage. The brutality of the killings, combined with the audacity of the gunmen disguising themselves as police officers, generated enormous press coverage and public outcry. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories about the massacre, and it became a symbol of the lawlessness and violence that Prohibition had unleashed in American cities. Capone, who had been in Miami at the time of the massacre and had an alibi provided by local officials there, publicly denied any involvement in the killings. However, there was widespread belief, both among law enforcement and the general public, that he had orchestrated the attack, and the massacre marked a turning point in public perception of Capone. Where previously he had been viewed by many as a colorful bootlegger who was simply providing alcohol to people who wanted it, the St. Valentine's Day massacre transformed him in the public imagination into a symbol of gangster brutality and lawlessness. The violence was so extreme and so publicly visible that it could no longer be ignored or rationalized, and pressure mounted on law enforcement and political leaders to take action against Capone and organized crime more broadly. Thus, for all his efforts to portray himself as a businessman and public benefactor, Capone was now overseeing acts of mass murder that shocked even a public that had grown accustomed to gang violence during the Prohibition era. The St. Valentine's Day massacre would prove to be the beginning of the end of his reign as Chicago's most powerful gangster. In the spring of 1929, President Herbert Hoover met with Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon and explicitly demanded action against Al Capone, stating that he wanted the gangster in jail by any means necessary. Hoover, who had taken office in March 1929, was under enormous public pressure to address the problem of organized crime and bootlegging, particularly in the wake of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, which had shocked the nation just weeks before his inauguration. The president viewed Capone as a symbol of the lawlessness that had spread throughout American cities during Prohibition, and he made it clear to federal officials that prosecuting Capone was a priority for his administration. However, conventional law enforcement methods had repeatedly failed to convict Capone of any serious crimes. The gangster had carefully insulated himself from direct involvement in criminal activities, using intermediaries to carry out orders and maintaining an extensive network of corrupt police officers, prosecutors, and judges who protected him from prosecution. Witnesses were routinely intimidated or killed before they could testify, and evidence had a tendency to disappear from police custody. As a result, federal authorities decided to pursue two parallel strategies to bring down Capone. The first involved creating a special unit of federal agents who would be incorruptible and who would focus exclusively on disrupting Capone's bootlegging operations through raids and seizures. The second strategy involved using the Internal Revenue Service to prosecute Capone for income tax evasion, a charge that would be difficult for him to defend against given his lavish lifestyle and obvious wealth. To lead the enforcement effort, the Bureau of Prohibition selected Elliot Ness, a 26-year-old agent from Chicago who had a reputation for honesty and determination. Ness was given the authority to assemble a team of agents who would be immune to bribery and who would report directly to federal authorities rather than to local law enforcement officials who might be compromised by Capone's corruption. Ness selected a team of 9 agents, including Marty Lahart, Sam Seeger, Barney Clunan, Lyle Chapman, Tom Friel, Joe Leeson, Paul Robsky, Mike King, and Bill Gardner. These men became known as the Untouchables, a nickname that originated from their refusal to accept bribes from Capone's organization despite numerous attempts to corrupt them. The Untouchables began conducting systematic raids on Capone's breweries and speakeasies throughout Chicago and the surrounding areas. Between 1929 and 1931, the team seized and destroyed dozens of illegal distilleries and beer production facilities, confiscating thousands of gallons of alcohol and inflicting significant financial losses on the outfit. These raids were carefully planned and executed without warning, preventing corrupt police officers from tipping off Capone's organization in advance. While Ness and his team were disrupting Capone's operations, a parallel investigation was being conducted by the Internal Revenue Service. Frank Wilson, a special agent with the IRS Intelligence Unit, led a team of accountants and investigators who were tasked with building a tax evasion case against Capone. Wilson's investigation focused on proving that Capone had earned substantial income during the 1920s and had failed to pay federal income taxes on those earnings. This required gathering financial records, bank statements, and other evidence that could demonstrate the flow of money through Capone's organization and into his personal possession. The investigation proved to be extraordinarily difficult. Capone kept few written records of his financial transactions, conducted most business in cash, and used various fronts and intermediaries to hide his income. However, Wilson and his team were able to identify several key witnesses, including bookkeepers and other employees of the outfit, who had knowledge of Capone's financial affairs. One crucial witness was Fred Reese, a cashier who had worked for the outfit and who could testify about large cash payments made to Capone. Another was Leslie Shumway, a bookkeeper who had maintained financial records for some of Capone's gambling operations. Both men initially refused to cooperate, but were eventually persuaded to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Capone attempted to intimidate and bribe both the Untouchables and the IRS investigators, offering enormous sums of money in exchange for their cooperation and making threats against their families. However, both Ness's team and Wilson's investigators remained committed to building their cases despite the threats and temptations. By 1931, the federal investigators had assembled enough evidence to proceed with charges, and Capone's era of operating with impunity was rapidly coming to an end. The combination of the enforcement pressure from the Untouchables and the financial evidence gathered by the IRS had created a situation in which Capone faced prosecution that he could not shoot or bribe his way out of. On the 5th of June, 1931, Al Capone was indicted by a federal grand jury on 22 counts of income tax evasion totaling over $200,000 in unpaid taxes for the years 1925 through 1929. The indictment marked a significant shift in the federal government's approach to prosecuting Capone. Rather than attempting to prove his involvement in bootlegging, murder, or other violent crimes, prosecutors focused exclusively on his failure to pay income taxes on the substantial earnings he had received from his criminal enterprises. Initially, Capone and his attorneys attempted to negotiate a plea deal with federal prosecutors. In June 1931, they offered to plead guilty to some of the charges in exchange for a sentence of no more than 2.5 years in prison. Prosecutors agreed to recommend this sentence, and Capone appeared in court prepared to enter his guilty plea. However, Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, who was presiding over the case, made it clear that he was not bound by any plea agreement between the defense and prosecutors, and that he would impose whatever sentence he deemed appropriate, regardless of any prior agreements. Faced with the possibility of a much longer sentence than he had negotiated, Capone withdrew his guilty plea and decided to go to trial. The trial began on the 6th of October, 1931, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. The lead prosecutor was George E.Q. Johnson, the United States Attorney for the Northern District, who had been instrumental in building the case against Capone. Capone was represented by a team of defense attorneys led by Michael Ahern. Just before the trial was set to begin, federal authorities discovered that Capone had attempted to bribe or intimidate members of the jury pool. In response, Judge Wilkerson switched the jury for Capone's trial with the jury from another courtroom at the last moment, preventing Capone's organization from knowing in advance who would be deciding his fate. The prosecution presented evidence from numerous witnesses, including the bookkeepers and other outfit employees who had been persuaded to testify about Capone's income and expenditures. Frank Wilson and other IRS investigators testified about their findings, presenting detailed financial records that demonstrated Capone had received substantial income during the years in question. The defense argued that Capone's lavish lifestyle had been funded by gambling winnings rather than income from illegal activities, and that gambling winnings were not taxable under federal law at that time. However, this defense was undermined by the prosecution's evidence showing systematic income from bootlegging and other criminal enterprises. On the 17th of October, 1931, after deliberating for 8 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 5 of the 22 counts, including 3 felony counts of tax evasion and 2 misdemeanor counts of failure to file tax returns. On the 24th of October 1931, Judge Wilkerson sentenced Capone to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion up to that time. Capone was also ordered to pay $50,000 in fines plus court costs and to pay $215,000 in back taxes and interest. The sentence effectively ended Capone's reign as the most powerful gangster in America. Initially, Capone was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, where he arrived in May 1932 to begin serving his 11-year sentence. Despite being incarcerated, Capone was able to maintain a relatively comfortable existence at Atlanta through a combination of bribery and his celebrity status among both guards and fellow inmates. He had his own cell, furnished with a carpet, a desk, and various amenities not typically available to prisoners. He was able to receive regular visitors, including his wife and other family members, and he continued to communicate with members of the Chicago outfit through intermediaries who visited him in prison. Guards at the facility were reportedly paid substantial sums to provide Capone with special privileges, including access to better food, alcohol, and even the ability to conduct some business from within the prison. Federal authorities became increasingly concerned that Capone was continuing to exert influence over his criminal organization despite his incarceration, and that the conditions of his imprisonment were far too lenient given the severity of his crimes. As a result, in August 1934, Capone was transferred to the newly opened United States Penitentiary at Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz had been specifically designed to house the most dangerous and high-profile federal prisoners in conditions that would prevent them from continuing their criminal activities or exercising influence over their organizations. At Alcatraz, Capone was assigned inmate number 85 and was subjected to far harsher conditions than he had experienced in Atlanta. The prison was deliberately isolated, with no contact allowed between inmates and the outside world beyond limited correspondence and rare family visits under strict supervision. Capone was no longer able to bribe guards or maintain his previous lifestyle, and he was treated like any other prisoner with no special accommodations made for his former status. However, Capone's health had already begun to deteriorate by the time of his transfer to Alcatraz. He had contracted syphilis as a young man, likely in his teenage years, and had never received adequate treatment for the disease. By the mid-1930s, the infection had progressed to neurosyphilis, a late-stage manifestation of the disease in which the bacteria invade the central nervous system, causing progressive neurological damage. The symptoms of neurosyphilis began to manifest noticeably during Capone's time at Alcatraz. He experienced confusion, disorientation, and memory loss, along with physical symptoms including tremors and difficulty with coordination. His mental faculties deteriorated significantly, and by the late 1930s, he was frequently confused about where he was and unable to carry on coherent conversations. In November 1938, Capone was stabbed by a fellow inmate, James Lucas, during an altercation in the prison barbershop. While the wound was not life-threatening, the incident demonstrated how far Capone had fallen from his position of power and respect, as even within the prison population, he was now vulnerable to attack. Prison doctors attempted to treat Capone's syphilis with the limited medical interventions available in the 1930s, including injections of heavy metals and fever therapy. But these treatments were largely ineffective against the advanced stage of the disease. By the late 1930s, the once powerful crime boss was a shell of his former self, his mind ravaged by untreated syphilis and his empire now controlled by others, primarily Frank Nitti, who had assumed leadership of the Chicago outfit in Capone's absence. On the 16th of November 1939, Al Capone was released from federal custody and immediately traveled to his estate on Palm Island in Miami Beach, Florida, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. Capone's physical and mental condition upon release was dramatically worse than when he had entered prison 7 years earlier. The neurosyphilis had caused extensive damage to his brain, leaving him with the cognitive abilities of a 12-year-old child, according to assessments by his physicians. He suffered from dementia, confusion, and frequent disorientation, often forgetting where he was or failing to recognize family members and old associates. Shortly after his release, Capone was admitted to Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, where doctors attempted more aggressive treatment of his syphilis using newly developed medications. However, the damage to his central nervous system was too extensive, and while the treatment may have prevented further progression of the disease, it could not reverse the neurological deterioration that had already occurred. Following his hospitalization, Capone returned permanently to Palm Island, where he lived quietly under the care of his wife May and a small staff of nurses and servants. His days were spent in simple activities such as fishing in Biscayne Bay, swimming in the pool at his estate, and sitting in the sun. He occasionally played cards with family members during his more lucid moments, but for the most part, he was a shadow of his former self, unable to engage in meaningful conversation or to comprehend the world around him. His son Sonny, who was now an adult, visited regularly along with Capone's siblings and other family members. May remained devoted to her husband despite his condition, caring for him and protecting him from the press and curiosity seekers who occasionally attempted to approach the estate. Capone had no involvement whatsoever in criminal activities during his retirement, and the Chicago outfit continued to operate under Frank Nitti's leadership without any input from its former boss. The man who had once controlled an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars and who had been the most feared gangster in America was now incapable of managing even the most basic aspects of his own life. In early January 1947, Capone suffered a stroke, and his health deteriorated rapidly over the following weeks. He developed pneumonia and cardiac complications, and on the 25th of January 1947, just 8 days after his 48th birthday, he died of cardiac arrest at his Palm Island estate. Capone's body was transported back to Chicago, where he was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in the suburb of Hillside, following a private funeral attended by family members and a small number of close associates. Over 3,000 mourners reportedly attended the funeral despite the family's attempts to keep it private. In the aftermath of Capone's imprisonment and death, the Chicago outfit under Frank Nitti continued to operate as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America throughout the 1940s. Nitti had assumed control of the outfit in the early 1930s when it became clear that Capone would not be returning to lead the organization, and he proved to be an effective, if less flamboyant, leader. Under Nitti's direction, the outfit adapted to the end of Prohibition in 1933 by shifting its focus to other forms of organized crime, including gambling operations, labor racketeering, and control of legitimate businesses such as restaurants and entertainment venues. However, Nitti's reign ended abruptly in March 1943 when he committed suicide rather than face federal indictment for extortion in connection with a Hollywood studio shakedown scheme. Following his death, leadership of the outfit passed to Tony Accardo, who had been one of Capone's most trusted enforcers in the 1920s and who would lead the organization for the next several decades. Accardo proved to be remarkably successful in maintaining the outfit's power while avoiding prosecution. He expanded operations into Las Vegas in the 1940s and 1950s, taking control of several casinos and using them to launder money from illegal gambling operations in Chicago. The outfit also maintained its control over labor unions and continued to extort money from businesses throughout the Chicago area. The organization faced increasing pressure from federal law enforcement in the 1960s and 1970s as the FBI intensified its investigations of organized crime. The passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, in 1970, provided prosecutors with new tools to pursue organized crime figures, and numerous outfit members were convicted and imprisoned in the decades that followed. Today, Chicago is a world-class city that has largely overcome the violence and corruption that characterized it during Capone's era. The murder rate in the city, while still a concern, is a fraction of what it was during the Prohibition years, and the political corruption that enabled organized crime to flourish has been significantly reduced through reforms and prosecutions. The legacy of Al Capone remains visible in Chicago, however, through tourism sites and cultural memory. The Lexington Hotel, where he maintained his headquarters, was demolished in 1995, but his estate on Palm Island in Miami remains standing. Tours of Chicago's gangster history attract thousands of visitors annually, and Capone's story has been told in numerous films, television shows, and books, most notably in the 1987 film The Untouchables and the 1983 film Scarface, which reimagined Capone's story in a modern context. Al Capone was something of an enigmatic figure. He emerged during a unique period in American history when Prohibition created unprecedented opportunities for organized crime, and when political corruption in cities like Chicago was so widespread that criminal enterprises could operate almost openly. Moreover, he grew up in urban poverty as the son of Italian immigrants, in communities where legitimate paths to economic advancement were severely limited, and where criminal activity was often the only means of escaping destitution. It could also be argued that Capone was simply providing a service that millions of Americans wanted, selling alcohol to a public that overwhelmingly opposed prohibition and viewed the law as an unjust intrusion into their personal lives. He gave jobs to thousands of people during the Great Depression, opened soup kitchens that fed the hungry, and distributed money to the poor at a time when the government was doing little to help those who were suffering. Many people in Chicago viewed him as a benefactor rather than a criminal. The reality is far grimmer, though. Capone was a mass murderer who orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of people, including the brutal St. Valentine's Day massacre, which shocked even a public that had grown accustomed to gang violence. He corrupted every level of government and law enforcement in Chicago, undermining democratic institutions and making a mockery of the rule of law. The violence and corruption that characterized Chicago during his reign made the city one of the most dangerous places in America, and the psychological and social damage inflicted on the community lasted for decades after his imprisonment. Consequently, while Capone might have claimed that he was simply a businessman giving the people what they want, the reality was that he built his fortune through violence, intimidation, and corruption, leaving a trail of victims that extended far beyond the rival gangsters who died in his wars for control of Chicago's underworld. What do you think of Al Capone? Was he a product of his times who provided what people wanted during an unjust Prohibition era? Or was he simply a ruthless criminal who exploited the law's failures for personal gain? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.